Welcome to Travels with Tulsans, sponsored by the Friends of the Tulsa City County Libraries. I'm Cecilia Whitehurst, and we are glad to have you join us for the fourth of our 2025 Travels with Tulsans presentations. We want to say thank you to the Rudisill Regional Library staff for hosting us again this year. If you would like more information about becoming a friend of the Tulsa City County Libraries, please pick up one of the Friends membership forms on the table in the back. We also have flyers because the adult creative writing contest just opened, so you can get more information about that if you'd like to submit any writing for that. You can also get yourself a cup of coffee or water while you're back there. We would love to have you join the Friends in supporting our 5-star Tulsa library system. Next Wednesday, we are going off the beaten path with Bill and Nancy Herman to some of the out-of-the-way places around the globe. It sounds intriguing, so be sure to join us again next week. Our traveler today is Skip Whitehurst. Skip graduated with an MA in geophysics from Virginia Tech, which was then called Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, or VPI, in 1977. While there, he worked in Antarctica for an austral summer season collecting data for another grad student's PhD thesis. After graduating, Skip worked in exploration for Texaco in Houston and then in Tulsa, and then at Reading and Bates Petroleum and Ladd Petroleum, and then switched to software engineering for digital logging in L3 Aramet. Skip has been retired since 2014 and has 2 beautiful and intelligent daughters. He's here to talk to you today about his time in Antarctica and New Zealand in the 1970s. Ladies and gentlemen, here's Skip. He does.
Thank you to my beautiful and intelligent daughter. Well, hello, everybody. And I'm going to be talking about a trip that I made to a place where very, very few people have been before we got there, and in the almost 50 years since we left. It was part of a research project for a PhD candidate's dissertation. And what we were doing was we were operating gravity meters on the floating ice of the Ross Ice Shelf. The reason we were doing that was because Rick Williams' dissertation was about tides in a large open body of water. And it's difficult to measure tides in the middle of a large body of water because the traditional tide gauges are basically useful near coastlines. And but he worked out a clever approach that worked quite well, actually. The Ross Ice Shelf is floats on the Ross Sea. And with gravity meters, you can actually determine changes in elevation by measuring the change of the acceleration of gravity, and you can get it quite accurately down to centimeter accuracy. And so we had these instruments set up in 3 stations the year I was there, and there had been 5 stations in prior years. So he had a set of 8 that he then used to analyze and create his dissertation. Ross Ice Shelf is about the size of Texas. And you can see it in red on this slide. It's due south of New Zealand. The prime meridian is going out the top of the image, and the anti-meridian, the 180-degree meridian, is going straight down. North America is off to the left, and the Asia and Indian Ocean off to the right. Let's see, McMurdo Station is the largest research and logistics station on the continent. It was operated by the United States Antarctic Research Program and supported by the US Navy, who provided air service and also icebreaker ships to replenish McMurdo. And McMurdo is on Ross Island. It's in the lower right corner of the Ross Ice Shelf, right there at the very edge of the permanent freshwater ice that's glacial in origin. All the glaciers from the landmass would flow down until they got to sea level, and then they would go outward, which is down on the on that map until they calved off at the northern edge. The team was Hugo Newberg, who was a longtime polar explorer. He was doing this in the 50s. I believe this was his 10th trip to Antarctica, and some of his early trips were for multi-year stays. He knew what he was doing, and kept us out of trouble, and had enough insider knowledge that we got away, or we knew how to do some things that we might have had rookie errors. And then Gary Moss was an engineering graduate student at VPI. He was a friend of mine, and when they were looking for an extra volunteer to go, he stepped up. Normally, they would have taken somebody from the geophysics program, but they didn't have anybody that was able to go. And so Gary said, "I'll go." And so we got a trip to the south. And then me at the bottom, and my scruffy self. But to start with, we left Blacksburg, Virginia, in the southwestern part of Virginia, drove clear across the country, mostly on I-40. We built plenty of time into the schedule in case we had contingencies to deal with, but we had no trouble at all. And by the time we got to Arizona, we had extra time in our schedule, so we took a side trip to the Grand Canyon. And then after that, we took a detour through Vegas, across the Hoover Dam through Vegas, and then on to Death Valley, and then on down to Port Hueneme and Point Mugu on the Southern California coast to catch our flight over the pond. So on the road, this was pretty much our first morning after we left. Yes? Yes. And that is a geology department Chevy van there. And it was packed with our scientific gear plus our personal belongings that we brought with us. And this is the Dardanelle Overlook on I-40 in Western Arkansas. It's not that far from here. And, you know, I look for it every time I'm traveling that stretch, and it always makes me smile when I pass it. In fact, I think that trash can is even still there. And Hugo was a very thrifty person, so we mostly ate out of. We brought some groceries with us and ate that. We did eat in restaurants some of the time, and then, like I said, we did take a detour, and so Hugo and I took a day trip to the bottom from the south rim of the Grand Canyon down to the bottom to Phantom Ranch, and then back all in one day. That's about a hike, and that's about a 20-mile round trip hike with about a 3,000 foot down and 3,000 feet back up. And Hugo was more than twice my age, and on that trip back, he kicked my butt. I was never more fit than I was at that time, but he was in much better shape than I was. Wow. Then we went on across Hoover Dam when you could still drive across the top of it, into Vegas. I got $1 worth of complimentary tokens and won $2 off a slot. Had a great buffet dinner at one of the casinos, and then on to Death Valley, and then from there on down to the California coast. There we checked in the scientific instruments. Gary had flown out from DC area and met us in California. The van had 2 seats, and and really no extra room because it was packed with all of our equipment. So we got on board a C-141 Starlifter cargo plane, and the seating on those is not exactly luxury travel. And that's not my picture of the interior. But that's pretty much the seating arrangement, except our seats were turned 180 degrees, so we were facing backwards. And we were staring at a huge cargo net that separated us from all of the cargo aboard the airplane. There were about that many people. And
they weren't showing you any movies.
I'm sorry. No, nope. And your cell phone didn't work then.
You didn't have one.
So the trip was, we stopped and refueled at Hickam Air Force Base by Pearl Harbor, then made another fuel stop in Pongo Pongo in American Samoa, and then on down to Christchurch, New Zealand from there. And the setting off point for the Antarctic program was from Christchurch. They have a big warehouse there, and that's where we checked out a lot of our cold weather equipment and some survival gear and odds and ends. And this was a picture from downtown Christchurch in October of 1976. And the sad thing is all of the buildings you see were badly damaged during the 2011 earthquake. And the red brick building on the left is still standing, but is boarded up. And the others that you can see in the background are gone. They were razed because they were damaged so badly. So anyway, we got a little bit of time for sightseeing, but mostly we were preparing to depart for the ice. So on down further south, and we took C-141 from Christchurch down to McMurdo, where we could land on frozen seawater. And the reason we did that was because the C-141s land on wheels, and the other aircraft, if they need to use the snow runway, they have to have skis. But the freshwater ice is glaciers that have been moving for hundreds of years, and the jostling makes a very, very rough ice surface that is not suitable for wheeled aircraft. So they'll land on the snow that builds up on top of them. So we got to fly down on the jet, but we had to fly on a ski-equipped aircraft when we were returning at the end of the season. The return flight was much, much slower. And so here's our welcoming committee, an ambulance and a fire truck. And we stepped off the plane and I almost turned around and went back. It was 40 below with about a 20 to 30 knot wind. It was cold. I stepped off the plane and immediately the neck strap for my camera just got solid. And so we headed up into town, and the next few days we got to explore around McMurdo Station while we were putting together our requisition equipment that was already at McMurdo, gathered together stuff so that it could be packed and shipped onward to our field stations. But it isn't just that dump that you saw before. It was actually quite pretty there across the McMurdo Sound. Those mountains are about 35 miles away. And then Mount Erebus is also on Ross Island with same as McMurdo, and that's the southernmost active volcano in the world. Observation Hill is a landmark just south of the main part of the station. And then this is looking back at the station from partway up Observation Hill. And in this, the building on the far right, about the middle of the picture on the far right with the plume of steam coming out of it, was the diesel power plant, which they got their electric power. And then to the left of it, the yellowish building was colorfully named Building 155. And that was our galley, the chow hall. Since it was an AZ operation, it was the galley, and the little shop where you could buy personal gear was the ship's store. And there were also, I think, 4 bars and 2 movie theaters. And the meals were served 4 times a day. We had breakfast, lunch, dinner, and what they called mid-rats at midnight. For the people who are busy doing things 24 hours a day. So you could always eat about every 6 hours. And then on top of Observation Hill is a cross that was erected in honor of Robert Scott, who perished on the way back from the South Pole in 1912. He and 4 others died. I made it to the pole. It came in second place into the race to the pole to Amundsen, who was a Norwegian, to beat him there by about a month, and Amundsen actually survived. But Scott's expedition was really not as well equipped as Amundsen's was, and they unfortunately didn't make it. They did the next summer. They set out a search party to see if they could locate the lost party, and they did find them and recovered their diaries. So we know a lot about what that location, what that trip was like. But
Have the bodies also?
no, they built a pile of snow on top of them. They collapsed. Two men died on the way from the pole down back to the ice shelf, and 3 of them were left, and their bodies were all in a tent. And so they just dropped the tent on them and then covered it over with snow and left them there, took the diaries and some of their samples they had taken. This was a hut that Scott's built on an earlier trip about 10 years, 1901 to 1904. They went down there on a sailing ship and stayed for 4 seasons and then sailed back. It was quite the effort. And because it's so dry and so cold there, those wood buildings just are remarkably well preserved. In fact, everything in the building is pretty much, it's like he closed the door and walked away, and you walk in and it's still there, and most of the contents of the hut are intact. But it's a heritage site, so you can't really do anything in there. And we saw a few penguins. These were in captivity, as you could probably tell. And then we went on to prepare for the field work. They wanted us to be ready in case we had airplane trouble. So the first rule was you had to be able to provide shelter for yourself. They said, don't stay in the airplane. It's a huge heat sink and you'll get too cold. So get out, and you could either dig a hole in the snow and then cover it up with sawed up ice blocks. And it was actually quite cozy in those. It's called a snow grave. But 2 people could basically, you bail it out at the bottom and you have a platform and you can sleep in sleeping bags, and it's surprisingly cozy. But one of the groups elected to build an igloo, so they got to sleep in that, and that was also cozy. And then if we ended up stranded on a glacier, we had to know how to stop arrest a fall. So we had ice axes, and we would have them available. And you basically drag the ice axe so you'd spin around feet first, and then lay on top, dig the point into the snow and lay on the handle and come to a stop. At least that's the plan. It was actually pretty fun. So our field work, the 3 red pins are mark where our own stations were going to be. McMurdo is in the far upper left. It's marked with a yellow pin. I don't know how well you can see that. McMurdo. And then this was called C16, J9, and F9. J9 was a drill camp operated by the Ross Ice Shelf Project. The idea was to drill a hole for scientific study all the way through the ice into the water below, and then they could do glaciological studies on the hole, and they could also take samples and study the biology of the water under the hole. C16 was operated by the Ross Ice Shelf Geophysical and Glaciological Project, RIGS, and that's where Gary Moss was stationed there. He set up his gravity meter and operated it by himself, and he was amidst a bunch of other stuff that was going on with the RIGS project. And then Hugo and I occupied this one way at the southern edge, southern tip of the ice shelf at the camp called F9. Foxtrot 9 was our radio call sign. And there were 2 of us because you're not allowed to have a 1-person field camp for safety reasons. If somebody gets injured or sick, you'll have somebody there to tend to. And also some heavy work getting things set up. But once things were set up, it was really pretty, one person could easily have operated the experiment. But you had to have two. So my official duty, I guess, was being a warm body. Those are lines of latitude and longitude. Oh, that.
Squiggly one. The dark one is.
Oh, that was the western edge of the Ross Ice Shelf is formed by the Transantarctic Mountains, and it's easy to see on this Google map image. But the eastern is just kind of a slope off the continent itself, and was kind of indistinct. So I drew that on there just to delineate where the boundaries of the ice shelf. Good question. And then the anti-meridian is there. And so these are east longitudes, and those are west longitudes. The transport on the continent was by C-130 Hercules transport planes with skis. And these are very flexible, very robust airplanes, but they did have one weak point, and that was the front landing gear when it's ski equipped. And if they had a hard landing and in rough terrain, it could break that, and that came into play later in the talk. But that's how we moved around, and those things can hold a lot of cargo. So we first started to set up our camp at J9. So we loaded up all our equipment and caught a flight that was actually on its way to the South Pole. So we thought, here's our chance. We get to go to the South Pole. Cool. And so we flew up the Beardmore Glacier, which was the route that Scott had taken. And this was much easier than that. And got all the way up to the Antarctic Plateau, the Polar Plateau, which is at about 9,000 to 10,000 feet of elevation. And the airplane suddenly, the noise on the airplane changed all of a sudden. And so look out the little porthole, and you can see that our number 4 engine was stopped. And so the pilot feathered the prop and got on the intercom and said, well, you probably noticed that, and it said they had an engine problem and he had to shut it down. And because the polar plateau is at 9,000 feet or higher, you can't take off on skis with 3 engines from that elevation. So we had to turn around and go back to McMurdo. So I missed my chance to go to the South Pole. A few days later, we caught another flight that took us nonstop to J9. You can see the drill rig to the right, and the airplane, they'd push the cargo out of the back and taxi forward a little bit and push some more off. And that's a little bit of our cargo behind the airplane there. And so we set up a shelter to hold the gravity meter. And we started by drilling a hole in the ice about almost 10 feet deep with a hand-operated auger, and then would pound these 4x4s about 10 feet long into the hole. And then we would move a floor section that had been modified with a section cut out of it over that, find where to put 2 more posts, drill those and hammer those in. And then we could put a stable platform that was separate from the hut itself to hold the gravity meter, which was extremely sensitive. You couldn't move it. That would register on the record and might throw its calibration off. So that was completely separated from the structure itself. And so you can see the top of our platform right there. It was plywood with an iron frame under it. And the James Wade huts themselves are Quonset shaped, and you build them up in these 4-foot long sections that are 16 feet wide with 2 4x8 floor sections that would attach together. And then you make it as long as you need to be by just adding more to the side. This one was 3 sections, so it's 12 feet long and 16 feet wide. nobody lived in this hut. We didn't actually have a person from our own project there. One of the scientists at the camp spent a few minutes every day doing housekeeping, making sure the ink reservoir for the pen recorder was and make time marks and as needed. But it was easily handled in somebody else's spare time. So inside James Way, it's quite cozy. Those are insulated blankets over it. And so that is the gravity meter sitting on the platform. And then behind it is the pen recorder, power supply that is runs on 120 volts, but 120 volts AC, but also is battery back. So not if, but when they have to service the generator, it can keep on ticking. And it also had an accurate time clock for so we could have accurate time on the records, as well as some calibration equipment. But it would pretty much run itself. You had to check on it, make sure everything was copacetic. But once you get it started and stayed on top of a few little things, it was really no problem. So getting to F9, Hugo and I were deploying next. And our C-130 flight flew out to another station that had already been set up about 2 weeks ahead of time, a meteorological station. Two grad students from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas were operating a station, and they were collecting snow samples and digging test pits so they could carefully map the strata of the ice and doing that sort of work. And their station was about 3 miles away from where ours was. We had a diesel generator, and we didn't want them to have to our exhaust to affect their experiments. And so we brought some equipment out to them and had a very hard landing at outside their station. Put off their cargo, and then taxied the airplane about 3 miles away from the mountains to where they set us up. And when they landed, you could see hydraulic fluid coating the underbelly of the airplane, and the ski had been damaged. And so they taxied to our station, pushed our stuff out, make sure we were set up in a safe configuration, and then left. And the pilot couldn't control the ski at all. It wouldn't retract and it wouldn't lower. So they were in a bit of a bind. They did a low pass over the tower at McMurdo, and Gary was aboard that flight. He helped us set our camp up, but flew back, and then he was going out next to C-16 to set up his own station. And he said the tower reported that the ski was drooping. It was the front of it was pointing down, and so they came in as gentle a landing as they possibly could, and it still dug into the snow, yawed the airplane, and the pilot apparently over-revved 2 of the engines trying to keep it under control. I over-revved it so much that the props stretched. So Gary had a very exciting trip back to McMurdo. I'm surprised he got back on one of those things at all after that. So getting set up from the Met camp, we taxied over to where we were setting up, pushed our gear out, first thing we did, set up a 2-man tent so we'd have someplace to go if everything went south, so to speak. Started the diesel generator before it got too cold to start. And once the generator was going, I had been setting up our shortwave radio, and called McMurdo, made sure that we could get communications with them. And so there's our, we're getting set up there. And here I am phoning home. And the pilot is talking to Hugo and another USARP, they call them. And once we were clear, it's like, bye. have a nice 2 months, because they weren't planning on coming back until they came to pick us up 2 months later. And so, you know, we're just looking, it's like, Hugo done this before, but I never had. Like, wait for me.
You can have these fuel for 2 months.
You see all those barrels there?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And there was another pallet of fuel drums as well.
What kind of food were you eating?
We'll get there. We'll get there. So some of it was frozen. Patience. But anyway, once it cleared up and after we got camp settled in, we had to do a lot of housekeeping, build the James Way, move our equipment into it, move our supplies into it. We dug some pits, one to keep frozen food frozen, one to throw our garbage into, and we dug another deep pit to use as our latrine. And got everything squared away, and we suddenly had a lot of time on our hands, so we could check out the beautiful, it was beautiful scenery there. And later we walked back along the airplane's taxi tracks to the other F9 station, had dinner with them. And that device on the right is a snow catcher. It would basically catch drifting snow that was, you know, more than about, I don't know, 5 meters above the surface. And they would measure the size and the shape of the ice particles as part of their study. And we fell into a routine. About the only fixed part of our schedule was we had a 9 a.m. McMurdo time call on the shortwave radio to make sure we were, so they knew we were still alive, pass any information. We would usually give them a weather report. There's Hugo taking wind measurements. And this is that flag. It was a little bit more worse for the wear after 2 months out in that wind.
You probably weren't standing out there dressed like that.
Yeah, it was windy that day, and if it was that windy, you wouldn't stay out there very long. But actually, on nice days, you could be down in your undershorts and with no trouble. And then there's me and my cot, just chilling, reading some magazines we brought with us. A lot of time to do puzzles and listen to the shortwave radio. Once a week, we would change the oil in the generator. That was the only time we shut it down. And the object was to shut it down, change the oil, and get it started before it got a chance to get cold, because it'd be much harder to start diesel when it's cold. There's a little 2 kilowatt gasoline powered generator next to it. So we'd use that as emergency backup, and we'd start it before we shut the main generator off, just to make sure we could use it. It would still work. And that was our weekly. And then every other week, we top off a tank we had for a kerosene heater. We just pump the diesel fuel into that too, use the same, because it's basically the same thing. Chow, we ate well. We brought some fresh veggies with us, but those didn't last more than a few days. So we ate those first. We had 2 cases of frozen lobster tails for a total of 48 lobster tails and some butter, and canned crab meat and shrimp. We had frozen Australian steaks and some frozen vegetables, and everything else was canned. And so we ate the good stuff first in case we had to evacuate early, and, you know, lived on the canned stew and what have you late in the season. Then we didn't have any initially scheduled visits from anybody for the entire duration. The Navy did not want to fly their C-130 out there any more than they absolutely had to. But the ice auger we used to set our station up with, some other project turns out needed it. So they contacted the British Antarctic Survey, and they flew a Twin Otter aircraft, a ski-equipped Twin Otter aircraft out there. And that was about 3 to 4 weeks after we had gotten set up. So it was really good to see somebody else, and they brought mail, and that was very welcome. And so I mailed a long letter to my girlfriend at the time, now wife, and then started another one. Meanwhile, Gary is at C-16. Here he is getting ready to help on a seismic line. Doing the show-off picture here. If you can't read it, those are dynamite, basically. And yeah, that's Gary just chilling. That's for a seismic survey. And then Christmas, our neighbors popped over with a bottle of bubbly, and then we ate, I think, probably the last of the steaks. And a jolly time was had by all. And then, of course, I had to have the hero picture. On a clear day with no wind, you could, like I say, you could be in undershorts and flip-flops outside. As soon as the wind came up, you'd head back in. But I was burning up taking that picture. And as the season wore on, you could see the snow drifts building up around our Jamesway, and compare that with the snow drifts around the other camp. Theirs was up halfway or higher up the Jamesway, and ours was not nearly as high, and it actually drifted around it and not against it. And you might notice that there's, they call a vestibule on the backside of ours, and just this in-swinging door on the other end. Well, this is where Hugo's experience came in handy, because the door leading out of the vestibule opens outward. And when the snow drifts up over it, you can't open the door. Well, they put vestibules on both ends. So they were trapped inside. The first big storm they had come through, that was even before we got there. And the only way they could get out is this has a canvas roof, and they managed to dislodge the canvas roof of one of the vestibules, climb out, get a shovel, and dig out the door so they could escape. So that's where it pays to go with somebody who's done this before.
I'm surprised they built them that way.
Well, there's not really enough room inside the vestibule for an in-swinging door. So that gives you about 4 extra square feet, which, you know, under the circumstances is good to have. Also, you know, keeps you getting a blast of cold air whenever you open the door if you use the vestibule. And as long as you're cautious about maintaining at least one in-swinging door, you're okay. And so as our fuel season ended, we packed up the equipment. Those are the 3 4x4s that supported the gravity meter. You could see warm air leaking down through the, just under the hut. It melted out the top part, but it was solidly in there below the immediate surface. So we pack up our gear, and they sent one plane out to take both camps, because they were minimizing the number of planes they sent out there. And because the lack of capacity, we abandoned both of the Jamesways and actually some of the other, the heavier equipment. Hugo insisted they take the generators back because those things are expensive, and, you know, they'd have to bring them back from the mainland US to replace it. So he talked, the aircrew didn't want to take it. And we left all the fuel. We had about half our fuel left over. And some food. We just left all of that behind, brought our scientific equipment and our personal gear, and left a bunch of stuff back there.
So you don't carry on like the national parks say, whatever you bring in, take back with you?
No, this is virtually empty land, and it's eventually will get drifted over with snow. The huts are probably buried under several feet of snow down and probably have collapsed. So we fly back to McMurdo, and I got to take a shower after 9 weeks and do laundry. You basically change underwear once a week, and then after about halfway through the season, that underwear you wore earlier was magically cleaner than it seemed like when you took it off. So we flew back. We checked in whatever equipment we had borrowed that we brought back, and then arranged for a flight out back to New Zealand and then onward to the continental US. And the flights from Christchurch to Conus, the continental US, are once a week. And Hugo arranged for us to stay an extra week in New Zealand so we could do some touring. And you'll notice that the snow's all gone. It was probably 40 degrees on a warm day there. And it would get up to 32 degrees at F9 on a sunny day, especially if it wasn't windy. It was perfectly fine.
I love that, keep off the grass.
Yeah. You see the grass down there? Packing material. So anyway, so we get aboard C-130 for the long flight back to New Zealand. And this was the first sunset we had seen since almost exactly 3 months earlier. The sun just circled the sky from October 24th until January 24th when we flew out. And we landed in wonderful New Zealand, and it was nice. We got fresh food. It was warm and green. We got fresh vegetables. So we had a week. So we went on kind of a whirlwind tourist itinerary in the middle of the South Island of New Zealand. We started at Christchurch and at the right side, and then made a big loop going to Milford Sound. We stopped at Mount Cook, which is over here, then down to past Queenstown to Teano, and then on to Milford, then retraced our steps, split off, went to the west coast, then up past some glaciers along the west coast, and then east across Walters Pass back to Christchurch for our flight out. So Mount Cook is spectacular. It's the highest point in New Zealand and Australia. It's 12,000 feet above sea level, and it's only about 20 miles from the ocean. So it basically comes straight out of the sea and up for 12,000 feet. And then, I'm sorry?
Is it volcanic?
No, it's uplifted. It's what they call the Southern Alps, and it's a plate boundary mountain range. And Lake Teano is a glacial lake that is on the way to Milford Sound. And then the road to Milford is just spectacular glaciated scenery. It's just awesome. And then in Milford Sound, of course, you get the traditional picture of Mitre Peak that every tourist has to take. I think there's a legal requirement. And also on the other side of the sound from Mitre Peak is this interesting waterfall that actually flows up. It cascades down, a small waterfall bounces off a oddly shaped shelf in the rock, ricochets up, and then falls the rest of the way down. And then we are heading on towards the west coast and ran into some of the local agriculture, shall we say. And so, you know, you had this flock of sheep that's being moved from pasture to pasture. And so they had the right of way. And the interesting thing was when the sheep didn't like to run or pass between two people that are across from each other, but it was so little space there that they sometimes would be crowded into doing it. And they would take a running start and they would leap when they were passing between us as though it was like an invisible fence there or something. I don't understand why, but every one of those sheep that did that, that passed between Hugo and me, jumped.
Oh my God.
So we carry on to the west coast of New Zealand. This is near the town of Haast, which is where the road that crosses from the east side of the island hits the west coast. And then from there, we move up the west coast past the Fox Glacier and the Franz Josef Glacier. You can see a tourist group climbing on the ice there. At this time, this was early 1977, it was February 1977, and the snout of the glaciers was probably less than a dozen miles from the coast. And the last time we were there, it's retreated miles up the mountain. Well, both of these have. You know, where we park to look at these, that's practically the start of the side trip to get to the glaciers. And on up the west side of the island, turn east, across Arthur's Pass. This was our last night there. Millions of waterfalls, spectacular country. And then on back to Christchurch, where we get back on board a C1. We turned the car in, turned in some camping gear we had borrowed, and got back on a plane, hopped back across the Pacific, same route in reverse, landed in Point Mugu. From there, I went to Los Angeles Airport, and Hugo and Gary drove the van back. And so I flew a trip from LAX to Dulles, outside of Washington. My dad, who was working in Charlottesville, Virginia at the time, picked me up. He had my car, so he picked me up there. And then I made my way back to Blacksburg. And about 3 days later, Hugo and Gary arrived back in Blacksburg, and that was the end of our trip.
Where's Blacksburg?
Blacksburg is southwestern Virginia. It's where Virginia Tech is. And that was it. And the epilogue is none of this would have been necessary anymore. Rick finished his PhD and got a job teaching geophysics at Tennessee. And then nowadays, yeah, they have you can take radar soundings from satellites and measure the height of sea level, basically continuously all over the world. And so completely eliminated the need for this particular, this trip.
Wasn't it fun that you got to go?
Oh yeah, it was. I'm so glad. We've run a little bit long. If anybody wants to stay, I can take some questions.
How many miles did you drive in New Zealand, Skip, when you went down and around?
Did the flight from the west coast of the U.S. to New Zealand?
No, when you were driving.
Oh,
New Zealand.
I think it was about 1,100 kilometers.
Oh, okay. It looks long.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was 1,100 kilometers, what, 600 and something miles.
Okay.
You comment at the very beginning about the Ross Ice Shelf. Is it separate from the rest of the continent or the rest of Antarctica?
The question is the ice shelf separate from the rest of the continent? And the answer is not really. It's just a flow, F-L-O-W, not F-L-O-E, of ice that's just sliding downhill until it reaches sea level and it gets pushed out into the Ross Sea. It's attached to the rest of the continent, but it's floating ice on top. So you could say, yeah, it's not really part of the continent, but the embayment is part of the continent too. So it's the seafloor under is part of the continent. So
Because there is land underneath.
yes.
Pretty bad.
Yes, there is, but the weight of the ice has pushed that land, so a lot of it is below sea level. It's basically rocks. The question is there land under Antarctica? The answer is yes, but parts of it, the weight of the ice has pushed the rocks underneath below sea level, and if it all melted off, that land would slowly rise. Yes.
People who live at McMurdo year round, and were there any female researchers there when you were there?
Yes and yes. The question was, are there people that stay year round? Yes. I think the winter over population, when we were there, I had a slide of says population 148 that I think was about typical for the winter over population then. I think it's probably fewer than 200 people now. And are there female researchers? Yes, there were. And we had basically a men's dormitory that we stayed in. It was nice. It had a sauna and a nice common room and a laundry. The women would stay in another smaller dormitory that was pretty much right next to it. They're much more common now than they were then.
Well, it's at McMurdo, is it international?
It's pretty much they support international efforts, and they do have visiting scientists from other countries, but it's primarily a U.S. operation. There's a New Zealand base called Scott Base that's about 2 miles away, and that's mostly Kiwis living and working there. It was a nice stroll over to Scott Base, if we didn't have anything better to do. Most of the communications with the rest of the world was by shortwave radio. Yes.
How far was your camp from the pole?
The F9 was at 84 degrees and 30 minutes south latitude. So it was about 5.5 degrees from the South Pole. So 350 miles. Yes. I brought puzzle books, and I brought several books to read, and we exchanged magazines and reading material with the other guys, and listen to a lot of shortwave radio broadcasts, Radio Australia and BBC mostly. And that was when the Gang of Four was the big news out of China, and we got heartily sick of hearing about the Gang of Four every single newscast.
I forgot what that was.
That was Mao's last wife and 3 other high Communist Party officials were basically trying to take over the government, and from the guy that was appointed to take over from Mao. And they got in a whole lot of trouble. Yes, over there.
And there are videos online. So you can watch it.
When we were there, New Zealand was described as 3 million people and 99 million sheep. And that was not an exaggeration. It was very, very rural. And there were lots and lots and lots of pastures full of sheep.
Did they let them wander at will?
I think they're in fenced pastures mostly. You can see where those were being driven from probably high pastures to low or vice versa. I guess early summer would have been the other way around. Yes, Mary.
There were sheep out on the slope of a hill that must have been incredibly steep. It was almost sheer slope. And
Yes.
they were grazing up on this hill. It was incredibly steep. We were just kind of blown away by it.
She was commenting about how the sheep would graze on very steep hillsides, and that's why there are this-away sheep and that-away sheep. Because the this-away sheep, their left legs are shorter, and the that-away sheep, their right legs are shorter. And if you believe that, I've got more. Yes, yes. I'm sorry, can you say that again? They're using some solar power. Most of the power is diesel. McMurdo was powered by a nuclear reactor for about 10 years. They built it in the early 60s. But by the late 60s, it had developed a leak. And under the terms of the Antarctic Treaty, you can't dispose of radioactive material on the continent. So they shut it down. And in fact, while we were there, they were excavating a huge amount of dirt outside the old reactor building to basically, they were filling the holes of one of the icebreakers since they delivered their one-way cargo. And so they shipped all that back. And I think that the captain of that boat, we went on board the boat and talked with the captain. And he said, it's like, yeah, he took a Geiger counter down there and it's basically background radiation level. But the treaty said they had to get rid of it, so they did. He said, as far as he knows, they're going to use that to as landfill and build a subdivision in California. It's self-heating. I think they do have some wind power there now. It's very windy. And the South Pole Station is diesel powered, I think. But I think they do have some solar just because. Our next door neighbors at F9, because they couldn't have a generator, they had a little solar array to power their radio and a couple of experiments. It wasn't very, it was I think it all ran on 24 volts.
They didn't have a generator?
No, it was an atmospheric study and they didn't want the pollution. And that's why we were 3 miles away.
Well, how were they staying warm?
They did have a diesel or a kerosene heater. But the kerosene heater on those dark colored Jamesways, if it was sunny out, you didn't need them. The pilot light was, in fact, put out enough heat that on a warm or a clear windless day, we'd have to open windows to keep it comfortable inside. The pilot light put out plenty of heat, and we only had to top off the fuel for our heater once every other week. And I don't think it was actually down all that much. We just didn't want it to run out. Anyone? Well, thank you, everybody.